The greatest illusion people live under is the belief that when something truly important is happening, it will be obvious while it is happening. History shows the opposite. The moment something becomes obvious to everyone is the moment it is already complete. Obviousness is not the beginning of change. It is the confirmation that resistance has ended. By the time people collectively say, "Now we can see it," there is nothing left to stop because perception has already adapted to the new reality. This is why the most powerful shifts never announce themselves clearly. They move slowly, quietly, beneath the threshold of alarm. People are not blind to them. They simply do not interpret them as significant at the time. Each small change feels temporary. Each adjustment feels reasonable. Each compromise feels manageable. And because no single moment feels decisive, no moment triggers unified attention, awareness is always postponed to later. The word obvious itself is misleading. People think obvious means undeniable truth revealed. In reality, obvious means normalized. It means the mind has already accepted something so fully that it no longer questions it. What once felt strange now feels familiar. What once felt intrusive now feels necessary. And what once demanded explanation now feels self-evident. That transition happens quietly, long before anyone agrees it has happened. This is why societies are always shocked by outcomes they unknowingly prepared for. People do not suddenly lose freedoms, standards, or boundaries. They slowly redefine them. Language shifts first. Expectations soften. Resistance is reframed as impractical or irresponsible. And once perception adjusts, behavior follows naturally. At that point, nothing needs to be enforced aggressively because people defend what they have already adapted to. The tragedy is not that people fail to see what is coming. It is that they mistake visibility for relevance. They assume that if something truly mattered, it would demand attention forcefully. But real power does not operate that way. It relies on patience, fatigue, and the human desire for stability. It waits for people to adjust internally before asking them to accept externally. This is why looking back always feels cruelly clear. In hindsight, the signs appear obvious, even overwhelming. People say, "How did we miss this?" The answer is uncomfortable. They didn't miss it. They noticed it briefly, felt unease, then returned to routine. The signs were inconvenient, and inconvenience is easy to dismiss when life feels busy and uncertain. By the time something becomes undeniable, it no longer feels threatening. It feels settled. Questioning it feels pointless, even disruptive. And that is the real danger of obviousness. When something is obvious, it no longer needs justification. It simply exists as the new baseline. At that stage, ignoring it is impossible, not because it is shocking, but because it is everywhere. This chapter is not about predicting what will happen next. It is about correcting a misunderstanding. Waiting for the moment when everyone can see it is waiting too long. Awareness does not arrive on schedule. It must be active before acceptance hardens into reality. Once something becomes obvious, the debate is already over. The decision has already been made quietly, collectively, and without ceremony. And that is why the obvious always arrives last. The most underestimated force shaping human behavior is not fear or force, but gradual acceptance. Sudden change provokes resistance. Slow change invites adaptation. When shifts happen incrementally, the mind does not register them as threats. Each step is evaluated in isolation rather than as part of a larger direction. Compared to yesterday, today feels only slightly different. Compared to last year, the changes can be explained away. And because each adjustment seems manageable on its own, the cumulative effect goes unnoticed until it is irreversible. Gradual acceptance works by lowering the threshold of objection. What once would have felt unacceptable becomes tolerable, then reasonable, then expected. This is not because people agree with the change, but because constant resistance is exhausting. The human nervous system seeks equilibrium. When pressure is sustained over time, adaptation feels like relief. People tell themselves they are being practical, realistic, or responsible. In truth, they are conserving emotional energy in an environment that never allows it to fully recover. Language plays a critical role in this process. Changes are framed as temporary, precautionary, or necessary responses to circumstances. Words are chosen carefully to reduce emotional friction. Loss becomes adjustment, restriction becomes protection, compliance becomes cooperation. When language softens, the meaning, perception follows. People adapt to the frame before they evaluate the substance. By the time the substance is questioned, the frame has already shaped the response. Another key mechanism of gradual acceptance is comparison. Each new step is compared not to what existed before the process began, but to the most recent adjustment. This creates a moving baseline. What would have seemed extreme years ago now feels moderate compared to what followed. Resistance weakens not because people are convinced, but because memory of the original baseline fades. Normal is redefined repeatedly, without ceremony. Fatigue accelerates acceptance. When people are overwhelmed, uncertain, or preoccupied with survival, they prioritize short-term stability over long-term consequences. In such conditions, questioning deeper implications feels like a luxury. Acceptance becomes a coping strategy. It allows life to continue without constant internal conflict. And once acceptance is internalized, external enforcement becomes largely unnecessary. This is why gradual acceptance is more powerful than coercion. Coercion creates visible opposition. Acceptance creates participation. People defend what they have adapted to, even when it constrains them, because admitting the cost would require confronting how far the baseline has moved. It is psychologically easier to justify the present than to acknowledge incremental loss. Importantly, gradual acceptance does not require deception in every case. Many who introduce change genuinely believe it is justified. Intentions can be mixed, confused, or even well-meaning. The mechanism works regardless of motive. What matters is pace, slow enough to avoid alarm, steady enough to reshape expectations. By the time people say, "This is just how things are now," the process is complete. That sentence marks the end of resistance, not its beginning. Questioning at that stage feels futile, even antisocial. The change has already been absorbed into identity, routine, and perception. This chapter explains why waiting for a moment of obvious injustice or clear overreach is ineffective. Gradual acceptance ensures that such a moment never arrives cleanly. Instead, there is a series of small adjustments, each easy to rationalize, each harder to reverse than the last. And once acceptance has done its work, ignoring what is happening is no longer a choice, not because it is shocking, but because it has become the environment itself. People do not ignore uncomfortable truths because they are incapable of understanding them. They ignore them because understanding would require change. Discomfort is not merely an emotional response. It is a signal that something threatens existing assumptions, identities, or routines. When that signal appears, the mind often responds not with curiosity, but with avoidance. This avoidance is subtle and socially reinforced. It does not feel like denial. It feels like postponement, rationalization, or emotional self-care. People tell themselves they will think about it later, that it's exaggerated, that it doesn't affect them directly. And in doing so, they silence the very awareness that could have prompted earlier recognition. Discomfort demands attention, but attention is expensive in a world already saturated with pressure. Many people are operating at the edge of emotional and cognitive capacity. They are tired, overstimulated, and uncertain about the future. In that state, engaging with ideas that unsettle foundational beliefs feels overwhelming. The mind seeks relief, not depth. Comfort becomes a priority, even if it is temporary or illusory. Ignoring uncomfortable truths becomes a coping mechanism, not a conscious choice. There is also a powerful social component to avoidance. Humans are deeply attuned to belonging. When an uncomfortable idea places someone out of alignment with their social group, family, or professional environment, the cost of acknowledging it feels high. People fear being isolated, dismissed, or labeled, so they mute their own perception to maintain connection. Over time, this creates a shared agreement not to see too much too soon. Silence becomes mutual reassurance. Another reason discomfort is ignored is because it rarely provides immediate solutions. Uncomfortable truths often raise questions without offering clear answers. They introduce ambiguity where certainty once lived. Many people prefer flawed certainty to open-ended uncertainty. Certainty feels actionable. Uncertainty feels destabilizing. And so the mind gravitates toward narratives that resolve tension quickly, even if those narratives are incomplete. Discomfort also challenges identity. People invest years building a sense of who they are, their beliefs, values, and worldview. When information or observation threatens that identity, the mind experiences it as a personal attack. Defensiveness replaces reflection. The question is no longer, is this true? But what does this imply about me? At that point, avoidance becomes self-preservation. Modern environments amplify this tendency by rewarding distraction. When discomfort arises, there is always an escape available: news, entertainment, work, debate, outrage. These distractions provide emotional movement without resolution. They keep the mind occupied while leaving the underlying question untouched. Over time, this trains people to associate discomfort with something to be escaped rather than examined. The most effective avoidance is not rejection, but minimization. People acknowledge discomfort briefly, then shrink it. It's probably nothing. It will work itself out. People have always worried about this. These phrases sound reasonable, but they serve a specific function. They reduce urgency without increasing understanding. The mind closes the file without actually reading it. This is why discomfort often returns repeatedly. It has not been resolved, only deferred. Each return is weaker, quieter, easier to dismiss. Eventually, the signal fades, not because the issue disappeared, but because perception adapted around it. And once adaptation is complete, recognition arrives too late to feel actionable. This chapter is not an indictment of human weakness. It is an explanation of human psychology under sustained pressure. Avoidance is a natural response when the cost of attention feels higher than the perceived benefit. But this dynamic has consequences. When enough people avoid discomfort at the same time, entire societies drift without realizing they are drifting. By the time the truth no longer feels uncomfortable, it no longer feels urgent either. It feels obvious. And at that stage, ignoring it is no longer possible, not because people finally see it, but because they have already learned to live with it. That is how the uncomfortable becomes unquestionable. What ultimately reshapes reality is not events themselves, but how those events are perceived, interpreted, and internalized. Two people can live through the same circumstances and inhabit entirely different realities, not because the world changed for one and not the other, but because perception filtered the experience differently. This is why the most decisive shifts do not begin with laws, technologies, or crises. They begin with subtle changes in how people think, feel, and interpret what is happening around them. When perception changes, behavior follows naturally. People do not need to be forced into compliance if they already believe adjustment is necessary. They do not need to be controlled if they internalize the limits placed upon them. Once perception adapts, reality reorganizes itself around that adaptation. External enforcement becomes minimal because internal acceptance has already done the work. This is how profound change occurs without obvious confrontation. Instead of demanding obedience, systems focus on shaping interpretation. Fear reframes caution as responsibility. Uncertainty reframes restriction as protection. Exhaustion reframes surrender as realism. None of this requires deception in the crude sense. It requires timing, repetition, and emotional pressure. Over time, people stop asking whether something should exist and begin discussing how best to live with it. The shift in perception is often so gradual that it feels natural. People tell themselves they are maturing, becoming more practical, adjusting to reality. They rarely notice how much their expectations have narrowed. What once felt unacceptable now feels tolerable. What once felt alarming now feels routine. This is not because people have become less moral or less intelligent, but because perception recalibrates under sustained pressure. Language accelerates this process. Words frame reality before facts are evaluated. When language shifts, perception follows. New terms replace old ones. Boundaries are renamed. Consequences are softened. Once the new language becomes normal, questioning the reality it describes feels awkward or extreme. The mind accepts the frame and stops interrogating the content. This internal shift is far more powerful than any external action because it operates invisibly. People defend what they perceive as normal. They resist threats to their adjusted worldview. At that point, reality no longer needs to be imposed. It is maintained collectively through habit and assumption. The shift has succeeded precisely because it does not feel like a shift anymore. What makes this especially dangerous is that people often believe they are still thinking independently. They argue passionately, choose sides, and express opinions, unaware that the range of acceptable thought has already been narrowed. Debate continues, but only within predefined limits. The illusion of freedom remains intact while the underlying structure tightens. This is why focusing only on events misses the point. Events are expressions of deeper perceptual change, not the cause of it. When people feel powerless to change outcomes, it is often because those outcomes were decided psychologically long before they appeared physically. By the time reality presents itself externally, perception has already adapted to accept it. This chapter is not suggesting that perception is fragile or easily manipulated. It is suggesting that it is influential and often underestimated. Those who understand this do not rush to control behavior. They patiently shape interpretation. They know that once perception changes, resistance fades naturally. If you sense that the world feels different, even when nothing obvious has happened, it is because you are noticing perception shift in real time. That awareness is rare, not because it is special, but because it requires slowing down in a culture that rewards constant reaction. And once perception has changed, reality follows not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. Which leads to the next realization. When perception shifts far enough, questioning itself begins to feel inappropriate. That is where the real point of no return appears. There comes a point in every major shift when questioning no longer feels dangerous, it feels inappropriate. This is the moment where change no longer needs to be defended because it has been absorbed into the moral and social fabric of everyday life. People stop asking whether something should exist and start assuming that it must. At that stage, opposition does not disappear because everyone agrees. It disappears because disagreement feels out of place, disruptive, or even unethical. This is the true point of no return. Not when rules are enforced or systems are implemented, but when questioning them triggers social discomfort rather than curiosity. The shift is subtle. Doubt is reframed as irresponsibility. Skepticism is labeled negativity. Inquiry is confused with hostility. People learn, often unconsciously, that asking certain questions carries a social cost. And most people are not willing to pay that cost repeatedly. Taboo does not require censorship. In fact, censorship is often unnecessary once taboo is established. People censor themselves. They choose silence over friction. They edit their thoughts before speaking. Over time, this internal filtering becomes automatic. The question never forms clearly enough to be voiced. Awareness is contained not by force, but by anticipation of consequences. What makes this phase especially powerful is that it feels justified. The new reality is framed as settled, necessary, and beyond debate. Questioning, it feels like reopening an issue that has already been resolved. People are told, directly or indirectly, that the conversation is over. And because humans are social beings, they often accept this closure even if they feel unresolved internally. At this stage, language becomes especially important. Words are used not just to describe reality, but to police the boundaries of thought. Certain phrases become shorthand for acceptable positions, while others signal danger. Labels replace arguments. Intentions are assumed rather than examined. The focus shifts from whether something is true to whether it is appropriate to say. Once that shift occurs, open inquiry collapses. This does not mean people stop thinking altogether. They think intensely, but within limits. Debate continues, but only around surface details. The underlying structure remains untouched. People argue about implementation, not legitimacy, about management, not direction. This gives the appearance of freedom while protecting the core assumptions from scrutiny. The most unsettling part is that many people feel relieved when questioning becomes taboo. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, ambiguity is tiring. When society signals that a matter is settled, people can stop wrestling with it internally. They can focus on coping rather than understanding. In a world of constant pressure, that relief is tempting. And once relief is chosen, awareness recedes. This is why so many people later say they felt something was wrong but didn't know how to express it. The social environment did not support expression. The cost of questioning was higher than the perceived benefit. And so discomfort was internalized rather than articulated. Over time, internalized discomfort becomes resignation. Taboo is powerful because it operates at the level of identity. To question is no longer just to disagree, it is to risk being seen as a certain kind of person. Once questioning threatens identity, most people retreat. They protect their place in the social order rather than their relationship with truth. This chapter explains why waiting for a moment of widespread awakening is unrealistic. Once questioning becomes taboo, awareness is already late. The shift has passed the stage where visibility matters. It has entered the stage where it is defended by those who have adapted to it. And that is why the title matters. Once something becomes obvious, it is no longer open to question. It is embedded, normalized, and protected, not by force, but by social agreement. Which brings us to the final realization. If questioning only matters before things feel obvious, then awareness has a narrow window. And that window closes quietly, without announcement. There is a narrow window in every major shift, where awareness still has meaning, and that window exists only before something feels obvious. Once the obvious arrives, the choice has already been made, not through a vote, not through force, but through quiet acceptance. This is the part most people misunderstand. They believe awareness is something that becomes important when things are clear. In reality, awareness only matters when things are unclear, uncomfortable, and easy to dismiss. When uncertainty still exists, when questioning still feels awkward rather than forbidden, when the future is not yet hardened into normality, that is the only moment where perception can still influence outcome. After that window closes, awareness changes function. It no longer offers choice. It offers understanding of what has already been settled. People may finally see what is happening, but seeing arrives too late to feel empowering. It feels heavy instead. The realization comes with phrases like, "I guess this was inevitable," or "there was nothing anyone could do." Those statements are not facts. They are the psychological residue of delayed awareness. This is why waiting for proof, consensus, or certainty is the wrong instinct. Certainty arrives last. By the time everyone agrees something is real, it has already shaped behavior, identity, and expectation. At that stage, questioning feels academic. It no longer changes direction. It only explains how the direction was chosen. The uncomfortable truth is that most people will only notice what's happening when it no longer feels possible to live any other way. That is when the shift becomes obvious. And obviousness brings compliance, not resistance. It brings rationalization, not challenge. People adapt not because they are convinced, but because adaptation feels easier than imagining alternatives that no longer seem available. The narrow window closes quietly. There is no announcement when it happens, no signal, no shared realization. It closes individually, one perception at a time, as people stop asking certain questions and stop noticing certain changes. The world does not suddenly transform, it simply feels settled. And once something feels settled, ignoring it is no longer possible, not because it is shocking, but because it defines the environment itself. This is why awareness is not dramatic, it does not shout, it does not demand action, it simply notices earlier than most. It remains present when others postpone. It stays with discomfort instead of escaping it. And because of that, it retains clarity while others normalize. The advantage of early awareness is not that it stops what's coming, it is that it prevents internal capture. You may still live within changing conditions, but you do not lose yourself to them. You recognize adaptation as adaptation, not destiny. You see the frame as it forms, not after it hardens. This difference is invisible from the outside, but profound from within. Two people can inhabit the same reality and experience it completely differently. One feels trapped, confused, and resigned. The other feels grounded, observant, and deliberate. The external world may look identical, but the internal experience is not. This is the ending most people never consider. The story does not conclude with collapse or revelation. It concludes with normalization. And by the time normalization is complete, the question is no longer what should we do, but how did this become so obvious? That question arrives too late to change the outcome, but not too late to understand why awareness mattered when it was still inconvenient. Once something becomes obvious, it is no longer open to challenge. It is simply lived inside. And the only real difference left is whether you noticed before the window closed or only after it was gone.